Welcome to my talk, everyone. We're going to be talking about breaking barriers and integrating accessibility into your software development lifecycle. My name is Maria Lamardo. I'm a Senior Manager of Technical Development Programs at CVS Health. I'm a Vue.js community partner and an accessibility advocate. Quick call out that my thoughts are my own, and I'll keep talking as if anybody wants to scan the QR code for the slides, here it is. Just a little background, I worked in applied behavior analysis for about 8 years, and I provided behavioral therapy for people with developmental disabilities for about 8 years. So I definitely have firsthand experience on the impact that inaccessible products and applications and devices have, not just on an individual, but their family and friends, and the way that they can interact with them and the world, right? A few years ago, at the peak of my health, I actually suddenly developed an autoimmune disease that limited my mobility, and I still have flare-ups now and then, but it forced me to leave that field because of health risk, and I kind of moved into technology where I discovered accessibility, and that's kind of where my passion comes in, because I saw the human side for my entire career, and now moving into the technical side, I can have a different type of impact, right? Like I can get my hands dirty into the code, and I know how to fix those issues that I saw for so many years. I'm an accessibility advocate. I headed the accessibility training team at CVS Health, and I also write and maintain the Vue 3 accessibility documentations. So let's get into what we're going to be learning about today. So we're going to do a little quick introduction on accessibility and then digital accessibility. We're going to go over some of the benefits and who it might benefit. We're going to go over the key principles of accessibility and how to integrate this into your working lifecycle. So let's start with an introduction. Before I get into the digital side, I do want to kind of take a step back and talk about the physical space and what it means and kind of connect some dots. But let's take a look at this building, right? And it has a lot of different steps going all the way up to the main entrance. Now, unless there's an elevator on the inside of the building, you can't go all the way up if you're in a wheelchair, for example. This is not a very accessible entrance. Let's take a look at another example. This one is an outdoor stairs that lead all the way up, but it zigzags all the way right, left. And though this is very pretty, right, and it seems to solve the accessibility problems because, hey, we've added ramps, this is actually not very safe. People have to go 9 times to go all the way up. There's no rail that goes along with the ramps. There's no safe way for you to stop and take a break, right? So it's a cool design, but it's not very usable. Let's take a look at this one. This one's definitely accessible, right? There's a ramp on the side of the building. Anyone who needs it can access the building through the side. However, this kind of gives people who need the ramp a different experience. So we're giving them an alternative experience than anybody else would use, right? People can just walk up to the entrance instead of using the side ramp. So I want to talk to you about inclusive design in a couple of slides. But first, let's go into some examples where the ramps were designed in an accessible way, but something went wrong in the implementation side. So here's an awesome ramp, right? It's pretty simple. There's a nice ramp, but they added a permanent street pole right in the middle. You definitely can't make it with your wheelchair all the way up. And here's another example. Here's, again, a pretty simple ramp, but they've added a giant decorative flower pot in the middle. And I'm assuming that's pretty heavy, especially after it's been watered, right? You can't really move it really easily. So again, this kind of highlights how important it is for your design teams and the people that are implementing your designs to collaborate, right? You have to understand the design intent behind this. And I'm talking about physical spaces now, but this definitely feeds into the digital side. Let's take a look at this ramp. There's a pretty easy, accessible ramp leading into the front of the building with a couple of steps next to it. And this is great, totally accessible. However, let's get into that inclusive design thing I was talking about, and which is designing in a way that the product or whatever you're building can be used by as many people as possible. So let's take a look at this example. This building has an entrance that is accessible to everybody. There's no need for ramps because there are no steps. You thought about these experiences from the beginning, and everybody will have the same awesome experience. And that's kind of what we're shooting for with our websites, right? There are many different ways to make something accessible, but we want to make sure that everybody has a fantastic, great, the same experience. So let's get into the web. Just like you wouldn't build a 10-story building without an elevator, there are a couple of things that you need to consider when designing and building digital content. So actually, I'll read this quote. The web is fundamentally designed to work for all people, whatever their hardware, software, language, location, or ability. And this is from the W3C. So to ensure that we're meeting this goal, we have to make sure that we're designing and building digital content in a way that is accessible and in a way that everybody can use. So let's take a look at how you can be successful. So you want to make sure that you're including accessibility into your entire product development, into your software development lifecycle. This includes things like making sure that you're running inclusive UX research, design, right, your development, testing for accessibility issues. Before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about the benefits. Who are we talking about? Like, who does this benefit? Well, disabilities can be classified into several types, and each have their own considerations. Here are some of the categories. We have physical, sensory, neurological and cognitive, speech, language, psychiatric or mental health, chronic health, temporary or situational. And to design and build digital content, I want to dive a little bit deeper for us to all understand what all of these mean. So let's take a look at physical disabilities. Now, it's important to note, right, that everybody's experiences will be different, but this type of disabilities can affect your ability to use traditional input devices like mice and keyboards. So some available resources that exist are things like voice recognition, eye tracking software, mouth stick, head wands, adaptive keyboards, single switch access. So again, here are just a few examples. And I also want to note that the effectiveness of the tool can also vary widely, depending on the individual's needs or even the level of expertise with a certain device. Just because somebody uses a screen reader doesn't make them screen reader experts. So don't expect them to know fully the entire functionality of how to use this tool. Next, we have sensory disabilities, which can have an effect on the way that people see or hear. And there are some available resources like transcripts, captioning, we have Braille, hearing aids, we have tools like screen magnification or screen readers, right? So again, different types of tools and different needs. For neurological, cognitive, speech, or language disabilities, people may be impacted or may affect their ability to read, understand math, understand or produce language, retain new information, and maintain attention. Some available resources are, again, screen readers, communication tools, text-to-speech software. And I'll have two more, but it's important to understand that this impacts individuals very differently. Again, the impact here is they can have a hard time regulating their emotions or responses. They can have a hard time concentrating or focusing and maintaining high levels of energy. Some available resources are wearable health monitors, relaxation or meditation apps, virtual health consultations, right? So there are things that we can do to help people navigate the web. Then we have temporary or situational disabilities that can impact the way that you can perform everyday tasks. So for example, let's say that you're carrying your baby and then your phone rings and then you might have to type something. You might use your voice to, hey Siri, send a text to whatever, right? So that's an assistive technology. And that might be situational. Or let's say that you break an arm and now you can't use your mouse. Now you're stuck using a keyboard, right? That's situational and temporary. So available resources here are things like keyboards, transcripts, caption. Maybe you're in a loud environment and you need to read the captions because you can't hear. You can use screen magnifications, screen readers, and mobility aids. So let's talk a little bit about disabilities around the world. It's estimated that around 1.3 billion people worldwide have some sort of disability. This is 1 in every 6 people, which makes about 16% of the world population. And they have a spending power of $1 trillion. So when we're not building accessible products, we're missing out on a large piece of the population, and we should not, right? We should be inclusive of everybody. So again, let's recap some of the benefits, right? We have ethical considerations. We are empowering people with disabilities to be more independent. so they can access our products and services, and it supports the principle of equality. We also have legal considerations where we can avoid potential lawsuits and also kind of stay on top of legal, like the laws and as things shift within the law. Business considerations, you can increase your brand loyalty and reputation by building and having accessible products. And of course, technical considerations, which can reduce your maintenance costs and improve your code quality, which are huge pluses. So let's dive into the key principles of accessibility. Luckily, W3C has created this awesome little handy set of guidelines that kind of guide us to create accessible content on the web. And I want to mention, let me just kind of switch over so you'll see what the documentation looks like. Oop, here it is. So you can see that they kind of talk about all of the things that you need to worry about. And let me just see that I'm on the right place here. But you can see that they have operable, and they kind of break it down here. So yeah, there's the operable section, then we have the understandable section and the robust section. So they kind of categorize all of the guidelines into 4 main groups. So let's go over what those 4 main groups are. Number 1 is perceivable. So this means that users must be able to perceive the information that is being presented, meaning that it should not be invisible to their senses. And we'll go over a few examples here. Operable, meaning that interface, forms, controls, or any navigation and anything that people can interact with in your applications must be operable, meaning that you shouldn't require something of someone that they cannot perform. Your apps should be understandable, meaning that the information and operation of the interface must be understood by all your users, meaning that you shouldn't have something that goes beyond your users' understanding. Then we have robust, where users should be able to access your content as technologies advance. And here, this is where using like the semantic HTML and the right ARIA attributes, role states, this will really help you make sure that your applications are robust and kind of stand the test of time. So I do want to go over some demos. These demos are a couple of examples of people using different types of assistive technologies. I will play a few minutes of each just to show you what that experience is like. Oop, let me just make sure the sound is good.
And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate.
75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center.
So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or Braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a Braille display as an input device.
And the navigation.
And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and presents you that information in a way that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading.
There are 3 items. Visit, link, image, home.
Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the page.
Heading level 2. Search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1. Make videos accessible.
So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using commands built into the screen reader. So that's all pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples of how that can fall apart. So I have a couple graphics on this page.
Mark site and hands on the MacBook Pro. Image.
So the first one is well described and uses an alt tag.
You are currently on it.
To describe what that graphic is all about. Now we go to the next graphic.
Reader 042116.jpg.
Much less useful. So it's important to use those elements. It's also true for tables. So I'm going to move to a table.
FDA approved medications. Table, 3 columns, 5 rows. FDA approved medications.
So the table is pretty self-explanatory, and I'm going to move into the table.
Medicine. Approve. Column 2 of 3.
And then if I go down into the table,
Total butamide.
and as I move across,
Approve. 1975. Column 2 of 3.
we're getting the labels for the column headers and row headers. So it's important when programming tables, forms, and other elements on web pages to use the proper HTML codes.
So I'll stop that one. Next, I want to share with you a demo using speech recognition.
I can control
This one's called Dragon Naturally Speaking.
my computer using only my voice, and I don't need to use a mouse or keyboard. So the way this works is that I can give commands to actually have Dragon start listening to what I say. Start listening. Go to sleep. I can also have it go to sleep so that I can talk to you all without having it try to act on the words that I'm saying. Wake up. Start Internet Explorer. Click Form Demo. Click full name. Thomas Logan. Press tab. Go to sleep. Now I've saved a command for my email address so that I can easily input it into this field. Wake up. My work email address. Click radio button. 1. Click checkbox. 1.
So I'm just going to pause it here really quick, but we heard him say, like, tab first name, right? Or he got to that first name field because of the name and the proper label that it actually had. And because this is coded in the right way, he was able to find the radio buttons without any additional prompting. And he was able to find and access the checkboxes pretty easily because of the way that it was implemented. So just a quick call out.
Press tab. Press tab. Go to sleep. When Dragon is in dictation mode, I am able to speak any type of text, and it will try to translate as best as it can. Wake up. Please let me know when the North Carolina t-shirt becomes available. Period. Press tab. Go to sleep. Now I've given focus to a custom control. This control has been made perfectly accessible, so I can easily control it with my voice, with the keyboard, or with the mouse. I'll show you how all three options work. Wake up. Click Next State. Click Previous State.
So I'm going to pause it here. He's also able to change because he knows the accessible name that those two arrows have. So next state, previous state. It would have been great if we could see the names underneath maybe, because if we didn't know what they were called, we could clearly have that indicator there to prompt us on what to say. But this is great. It's implemented in a perfect way, right? Next, I want to show you this last demo, which is of a Braille display.
I'm Mandy, and I work as a sales consultant for HumanAware, who make adaptive technology for vision impaired people. Today, I'd like to demonstrate our brand new Braille Note Touch, which is the first Google certified Braille tablet. So this is the Braille Note Touch. It's HumanAware's latest generation of note takers. We've been making Braille notes for many years, which are productivity devices, allowing people to take notes, schedule appointments, etc. The difference between past versions and this one is that it's a Google certified Braille tablet. So it's a note taker, but it's based on an Android platform, which allows us to use Android apps as well as our own programs. It's a unit that allows me to do Braille entry with the Braille keys on top, and it has a Braille display so I can read the text that I'm producing or reading from other people. By doing a W, I can jump straight to the word processor.
Word processor, keyword.
And you'll notice it has speech as well. I press enter because I want the word processor.
Keyword, recovery file exists. Keyword, do not personalize the session properly. Do you want to open the recovery file to save it or discard it?
It's given me a message telling me I forgot to close my other message properly, and there's a discard button. I'll just do D
Discard button.
and enter.
Keyword menu.
Now I'm going to do C for create.
Create.
Enter.
Loading. Text rate 3 billion.
And it allows me now to write,
That's
this
1.
is a test document, not very original.
6. Document. Top.
And I can read that in Braille. I can play it back with speech.
This is a text document.
And I can slow it down.
Fast. Normal. Slow. Very slow.
Whoops, I've slowed it down too much.
Very slow.
And so
Top.
it's
Slow.
it allows me to also use a headphone, etc. So I can write my document, my notes, my thesis, whatever I'm writing, and I can exit out of this document.
No exit keyword. Do you want to save your document?
Do I want to save it? Let's
No.
say N
Yes.
for no,
No button.
enter.
Keyword menu.
Now what's remarkable
Create.
about this is in an environment where I have support from sighted people, I can lift up the screen and I've got a visual display on the tablet. So I can now work with sighted peers to collaborate with them. If I'm a student and I want the teacher to check my work, they can look in at the visual.
All right, so I'll pause it there. So again, I just wanted to show you the different types of assistive technologies and how people use these to navigate content. So let's get back to the presentation. Alrighty. So let's talk about some considerations under the perceivable section of the WCAG guidelines. Here they kind of outline some recommendations and some, I guess, requirements that you should really meet when building your applications. Again, this relates to making sure that people are able to perceive information and content that's being presented. And some of the guideline here is making sure that you're providing text alternatives. So we saw in that first example that it was like an image and it was like 1, 2, 3, JPEG, right? Completely meaningless. So we want to make sure that we're adding meaningful text alternatives. We also want to make sure that time-based media has alternatives, so transcripts, right? We want to make sure that we're creating content that can be presented in many different ways without losing the informational structure. So this is like resizing your browser, right? You should be able to access everything. You shouldn't be losing any functionality. You also want to make sure that you're making it easy for people to hear and see your content. Operable considerations. So this is the second piece. You want to make sure that everything is navigable and usable, but with your keyboard, for example, that's a great way to test. So again, all functionality should be usable by your keyboard. You want to make sure that you're giving people enough time to interact with your content. You also want to make sure that you're not causing anybody any seizures or any physical reactions. You want to make sure that people can navigate through, find content, and find where they are on your page. And I'll show you some, I guess, examples of all of these soon. Let's talk about understandable considerations. We have one more after this. But again, you want to make sure that your content is readable and understandable. We usually try to shoot for about a 5th grade reading level with your content, unless it's kind of industry jargon, right? Sometimes that's hard to get away from. You want to make sure that things are appearing in predictable ways. So for example, your links should all kind of look the same. They should be underlined, right? If you have actions like buttons, they should pretty much look the same. You shouldn't have a button that kind of just looks like text without any border, right? Because that's really hard to recognize. You also want to make sure that you're helping people not make mistakes. So for example, in your forms, you're providing enough instructions or descriptive error messages so they know what to fix. Next, we have robust. So again, kind of talking about maximizing the compatibility of your applications and making them kind of future-proof, make sure that they remain accessible as technology advances. So let's talk about integrating accessibility into your development lifecycle. So everything I just went through is part of WCAG and their recommendations, but that's just the beginning, right? Even though you might meet all of the standards, check all the checkboxes, your applications might still not be accessible to everybody, right? That's just the starting line. So one of the things I highly recommend is for you to include people with disabilities into your workflows. So whether that's through user research, your design folks, right? Your implementation, your testing especially, right? Get some screen reader users that know the tools to test your applications for you. So let's talk about gathering requirements. So number one, make sure that you're including accessibility in your definition of DONEs for all of your features, right? As you're building things in, make sure that you know what should be required so that your application is accessible. Make sure that you're adopting inclusive design principles. That way you're improving accessibility from the beginning. In the development phase, you want to make sure that you're using semantic HTML and use ARIA appropriately. And we'll go over some examples here and the importance of this. Number 4, in your testing phase, you want to make sure that you're running not just manual, but there are some automated accessibility tests that you can run. There will always be manual tests that you need to do to make sure that you're capturing everything, but there are some cool tools for that. And make sure that you're making continuous improvements. Gather feedback from your users and make sure that you're fixing any accessibility issues that are reported. All right, so let's dive into some common accessibility issues and kind of how that works in our development lifecycle. So WebAIM actually does a great report that kind of looks at the top 1 million sites and looks at the homepage. And they actually found this year that 96.3% of homepages have accessibility issue. That's a pretty big number, right? That's a lot of accessibility issues in the top websites. And they found an average of 50 errors per page. However, one good thing out of this is that 96.1% of those errors actually fall within 6 categories. So today I would like to not just talk to you about all of those 6 categories, but I pulled a few other ones that came out of other reports that did similar kind of testings. So WebAIM found that low contrast text is one of the biggest issues, followed by missing alt text, which we've kind of already covered. Empty links, that's an interesting one. Missing input fields, input labels. Empty buttons, missing the document language. And then the other groups found visual indicator issues, heading issues, keyboard navigability issues, and missing ARIA attributes. So let's go over a few of them and how we can prevent or solve them and actually find them. So low contrast issues. Part of the requirement here should be that you're providing enough color contrast between your text and your background. The impact is that this text can be read by people who have low vision or cannot see the full range of colors. So let's go through an activity, but I do want to call out that you can run automated tests to catch some color contrast issues. However, there are some things that this automated tests will miss. For example, the color contrast of your placeholders that appear inside your input fields. They will not test this, right? So let's dive into the example. Oh, by the way, this is the report. Definitely a great read if you're into it, but it kind of shows you the different trends of those issues across the last 5 years. But this one is the color contrast. As you can see, I have like 2 examples. The first line here, the contrast is too low, and the next one is just right. So I've actually gone in here and I have Axe DevTools in my browser. So I opened that up and I ran an accessibility test. So let's see if I can actually reload to run this test again. Well, it just kind of leads me to run this test, and you can kind of open it here, open the issues that it found here, and then it tells you, hey, there's not enough color contrast. And one of my favorite tools to play around with to select the right colors for my application is this one created by WebAIM, where you can kind of select different colors, and depending on the colors that you select, they do have some examples underneath that kind of render that example. So you can change kind of the background color and the color of your text. And as you can see, as I do this, it also updates not just the example, but my contrast ratio score right here. And it even tells me, hey, you're failing across the board pretty much with this example, right? So you want to kind of play around, make sure that if you have different themes, test them out.
Yeah, so excuse me if this is a naive question, I'm kind of new to accessibility. Is there a system setting for, like on your OS for this? Like, is there a high contrast system setting that you can detect? And we have light mode and dark mode, for example, on our app, but is there also like a high contrast system setting that we could detect? Because I'm not sure if you're recommending that we always provide high contrast or just have an option.
Great question. So I'll repeat it for the recording. So the question was, is there a setting that people can kind of edit themselves to show that high contrast, right? Or is that something that we should always set? I will say we should always meet the minimum requirement. So I'll kind of try to shoot for an example here, but I think I'll just go back to a white background. And we can see that we're meeting that first one, right? So I think the first one is like 3 to 1 color contrast ratio. So as long as we're meeting that 3 to 1, people can then enhance that contrast level, but we always want to meet the minimum. And I think I saw another hand. Yeah.
Could you tell us the name of that color testing?
Yes, so it's Color Contrast Checker by Webbing, and I also provided a link to this in the presentation. All right, so let's go back. And sorry about all the tabs here. So again, here are some resources, and I added that color checker, and then they also have another checker for the accessible web. And there, I've also added some Figma and Sketch plugins, if you're a designer, that also will test the color contrast within those tools. I also want to call out that it's not just color contrast, right? People can have color blindness, and they might not perceive the different color combinations that you're using within your application. So in here, in this slide, I have an example of many different color wheels. The biggest one all the way to the left, you can see all of the color hues. So you see reds, yellows, greens, blues, purples. And as we move to the right, I have different color wheels for different types of color blindness. And we can see that not everyone can see red, right? Some of them are missing, actually, all of them are missing green. And I'll show you this other slide that has a different set of examples. And it's kind of like a field of flowers that has a lot of colors. So thinking about how you would implement this in your site, let's say that you have instructions that say, click the red button. Well, not everyone's going to be able to find that red button, right? So you want to make sure that you're very descriptive in your instructions and that you're not relying on things like color alone to provide important information for anybody. All right, let's go into missing alternative text. So the requirement here is that you're providing text alternative for non-text content. And the impact here is that this text content can be then changed into other forms, whether that's visually, auditory, textually, or any combination. So actually, assistive technology will grab this information from your browsers, and they will let the users know what this information was. The recommended testing, you can catch if something is missing an alt text. However, I recommend you manually test your alt text to make sure that they're meaningful. And I'll go over an example in a bit. But here's a great resource, actually, and I'll try to, let me see if I can hop over. All right, it's the next one. They do have, W3C has created a decision tree to help you navigate how to create an alt text that's appropriate for your use. And let me go back to the presentation to give you an awesome example. Okay, so here's an example of an awesome picture that I created. And I've given it an alt text of puppy rolling on the grass with Scott's super soft toilet paper. And this fits perfectly if I'm selling toilet paper, right? This is a great descriptive text for this. However, what if I didn't do that on my website and instead I did something like adorable happy puppy rolling on the grass ready to be adopted because I'm running a puppy adoption agency, right? So again, this kind of goes hand in hand with how your designers are building this and what is their intent behind including such an image, and how can you as a developer implement this in a way that is meaningful for your users. And of course, anything that's decorative, we don't want people to kind of stumble upon and kind of waste their time getting to decorative elements, so we could give this an alt text of empty. That way it just skipped. The assistive technology will pick this up as a decorative thing that they could just kind of ignore and move on to the important content. And you could also, there are two versions here, one for image, one for SVGs. All right, let's move to visual indicator issues. The requirement here is that you're providing a visual indicator that lets people know where they are as they move through your application. The recommended testing is to manually test your applications. And you can do this by simply tabbing through your application and making sure that there's a visible indicator as you navigate. And there are some resources that can help you, again, color contrast, check your focus indicators. And let's see if I can get to this from here. I'm gonna tab a few times. All right, so this, I'm playing around with this one because this is an awesome tool. This is ARIA Authoring Practices, and I'll go over this in a little bit more detail later. But I'm gonna start tabbing, oops. Yeah, I'm gonna start tabbing. As you see, as I'm tabbing, I can see that little focus that moves in the elements that I'm currently focused on, and that's exactly what we wanna see in our applications. If you ever lose this focus, then you gotta make sure that you're fixing this in code. Alrighty. Next, let's talk about empty links issues. So you want to make sure that you're providing text link that is appropriate and is associated with the link, and you're describing that link's purpose. That way people understand the purpose of that link and they can determine whether or not they want to follow that link. So instead of having a bunch of links that say click here, or learn more about what, click here for what, right? So make sure that you're giving them enough context. One thing I'll call out is that there is a way for assistive technology to navigate the same way that we saw in that demo that he was navigating through headings. You can also navigate through links. So if all of your links just say click here, that is really meaningless if you're navigating through the link. So make sure that you're providing very clear link text. All right, then let's talk about missing form input labels. You want to make sure that you're providing visible, clear labels on top of your input fields. That way, not just people will know the type of data that needs to be inputted, but also assistive technology will grab this information and let people know, hey, this is what's expected. And like we saw in that other example, people can then, knowing the name of the input, with their voice, activate that input field immediately. So I do have another activity for this one. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time looking through the side panel here. All right. Alrighty. Let's see if I can move that. Well, sorry about the screen cutting this off, but there's a field here that says first name, right? And I'm just gonna quickly go and inspect that field. In fact, maybe faster if I just right click into it. All right, so I am on the input field and I'm gonna jump, I'm in Chrome and I'm gonna jump into the accessibility tab here. And you can see that in here, I have a couple of things to kind of navigate through and like figure out. But one of the things that I wanna call out is that under the computer properties, there's a name property in here. And it tells us that the name of this input field is name, and it's actually grabbing it from the label. And you can see that it's also picking up things like roles, and the description that's also grabbing it from the text underneath. And we can see in here the code on like how that's actually happening. Yeah, with the label, right, the input field and the descriptive text underneath. Alrighty, let's jump into the next one. And again, you can do automated tests for this, but again, manual tests to make sure that you're writing the right and appropriate labels for your input fields. And WebAIM has an awesome guide on how to create accessible forms that I highly recommend if you're working on forms. Heading issues. You want to make sure that your headings are descriptive to that topic or purpose of your section of your page. That way people can understand the information that's on their site, how it's organized, and they can jump to the section that interests them the most. And we do recommend manual testing for this because assistive technology is going to miss if a section is missing a heading. So with that, I'm going to jump to the headings section. And I do want to call out, in fact, I'll click anywhere on here. Let's see. I'll pull this one up. I do have, yeah. So I do have this headings map that allows me to kind of just quickly see all of the structure of the headings on the page. And you can see that they're kind of nested within the hierarchy. So H3s should be embedded on top of an H2, right? You shouldn't be skipping heading levels. And then this creates this nice structure that people can navigate through really easily. I really recommend that you install this little tool in your app. It's great. This one is headings map. And I have a link in the presentation here. Yeah. Heading map for Chrome. And here's some of the guidelines for headings. You want to make sure that your headings are giving structure to your page, that you're nesting them in hierarchical order all the way from H1 all the way down to H6, that you're not skipping heading levels. So for example, you shouldn't go from an H2 to an H6. That's going to confuse users. You should have the most important heading as your H1, followed by all the other ones, and make sure that they're descriptive. Moving on to keyboard navigability, you want to make sure that everything is functioning with the keyboard or keyboard interface. That way, people who are not using a mouse can use your application without needing eye-to-hand coordination. So I'll skip this example because of time, but for example, an accordion. Accordions have specific expectations from users, right? They expect to be able to tap to it, to use because they should be buttons, like proper semantic buttons, they should be able to interact with their enter and space key to expand or collapse those accordions. So again, you have to make sure that you're building things the way that people expect them to function with their keyboards. And there's a great resource that I'll go over in the next example. We also want to make sure that we're adding the document language on the page. This allows assistive technologies to render this text more accurately. And there's an automated test for this. You also have to make sure that the right language is chosen, but automated tests will pick up if something is missing. So let me show you these two examples. Let me see if I could just open them from here. Nope. But I'm going to show you the same website in two different languages, and I'm going to turn on my screen reader so that we can hear the differences between the two pages. In fact, I'll just do it from here. But the first one's going to be in French.
Heading level 1, item 2, collapsed button. You are currently...
Give me 1 second, it's in the wrong browser. I have lost my mouse, y'all. Okay, there it is. See, an accessibility issue. This little mouse pointer is so tiny over there. All right, so I'm going to jump into the French website.
Visited blank. Changement. Visited blank. L'original en anglais.
So that's definitely French, right? I'm going to jump to the same website, and this website will have the English language set.
Blank. Developed. Unselected. When website blank. What is web accessibility? List 7 items. Voiceover off.
So that was voiceover. So again, this kind of showed you the different, how the language has an impact and how assistive technologies will pick up that language. It will read it in that language. So you want to make sure that you're adding the right one in there. All right, next up, we're going to talk about empty buttons. And one of the requirements is that buttons have a programmatic name, that you're not leaving them empty. That way, assistive technologies, like everything else, will be able to pick this up. So I'll skip this example, but similar to the example that we saw in that demo, if we have proper names to those unique buttons that are custom, so it just had an arrow, right? It didn't have any words inside of it. Let's make sure that we're using things like ARIA label or adding alt text in the image itself. Make sure that that has a proper name to it. And you can use the dev tools that I showed you to look at the accessible name under the computer properties. And this is the last one, ARIA attributes. So you want to make sure that all of your user interface have a name, a role, and the corresponding states and properties. So this is, and again, you can check this out in the same computer properties section in your browser if you're using Chrome. And I will go over this activity because this one's pretty cool. But automated tests will catch some missing attributes, but not all. You definitely have to do some manual testing, especially when you're building custom components. So I will jump over to a resource that's one of my favorite resources that exist in the web for accessibility, of course. And that is the W3C patterns. Yep. In fact, let me see if yeah, okay, perfect. So in here, I do want to call out that they do have a patterns option here that will show you different types of components and how to build them, right? So I'm gonna quickly find tabs, and again, they have everything: combo boxes, dialogues, grids, disclosures, landmarks. I'm gonna jump all the way down to tabs interface. And one of the things I wanna call out, that part of this specs that they will show you things like about this pattern that you need to know. And there are some things that aren't semantic to HTML. Like here they say that you need a tab or tab interface, that you need something called a tab list and a tab panel. That doesn't really exist in HTML, right? So they do have some examples for all of their components if you wanted to just test them out for yourself with your keyboard. They also call out the expected keyboard interactions for this component. So if you're not sure how somebody expects to interact with these, they list out all the rules. This is an awesome resource. And not just that, but they also call out, if you kind of scroll down, they have a section for WCAG, ARIA, roles, states, and properties. Now this is what kind of enhances our HTML, because HTML doesn't have all of these things built in. So you have to add things like ARIA roles, labels, states, and all these properties so that this is translated for assistive technology, so somebody knows that they're interacting with a tab, with an accordion, right? They know that this is not just a button in the wild, right? And that they know that once you open the accordion, it's expanded or it's collapsed, right? Once you close it. So it communicates way more than we could communicate with just semantic HTML with our ARIA. As we close out, I do want to call out a couple of things. So we just talked about ARIA. However, a huge call out is that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So we talked about that research that they ran. They actually found that the home pages that had ARIA present actually had 68.5% more defects than those that didn't. And this is not because ARIA doesn't work, it's because maybe people weren't following the specs as they should have, right? So if you're unsure, hands off. Else, read the documentation that I showed you. That's a great, great resource for understanding what should be added into your components. And again, here's that pattern resource. And again, this helps expand the native functionality of HTML. All right, so in summary, what did we learn today? Number one, we want to make sure that we're including people with disabilities in your process. Consider what tools they're using, how they use those tools to navigate your content, and include the accessibility requirements in the definition of done. You also want to make sure that you're considering how your design decisions impact that end user, and make sure that you're using best accessibility practices to build out this digital content. And you want to also make sure that you're running automated tests and manual tests to catch any accessibility issues. And of course, fix them. Don't just catch them, fix them. So with that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out or raise your hand. All right, I see a couple hands. Mitch?
Yeah, so you're familiar with Vue, obviously. To what extent can you comment on if you used or have your teams used componentry to better enforce or guide the required use, proper use of things like ARIA markup in the actual page?
Yes, I will say, so the question was, can you use kind of components to make sure that it's implemented correctly, right? Yes, but it depends, right? Because you can have a perfectly accessible component that by itself, like standalone, it's accessible. And once you put it in an application, depending on where it is, where it falls, how it interacts with the other pieces or the other content on the page, it might break, right? So I would say that it's always important. Yes, I think it's a great strategy, right, to build accessible components from the start and then start introducing them into your product. But keep in mind that just adding them doesn't keep the accessibility that they kind of brought with them, right? You have to make sure that everything within that page or within that structure makes sense. Hope that answered your question.
So there's a context sensitivity to it as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you had a question?
So to kind of follow up what he was saying, I struggle with heading specifically when you are making components, because if you're just dropping it in whatever page and you're reusing it, those headings can get out of order. So I'm just curious if there are any recommendations on how to handle that.
Actually, yes. One of the resources that I have on that heading slide does talk about like how to properly lay out your headings in your page. Definitely check that out. But yeah, that's a great call out. Depending on how your page structure, you can't just drop everything in there. You might have to change a few settings in your headings to make that make sense. Any other questions?
Kind of piggybacking off of that, would you suggest like a prop or a value you could pass to a component that says like, make sure the heading for this, when it renders, is like falling under 4, you know, or something?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. The question was, should you just always kind of build in a heading level within a component, right? I would say that that's really, I would advise against that because that's really tricky. Because then developers can grab that and put that anywhere in your application, and if it breaks the hierarchy of where you added it, then you're in trouble. I would say that you can add a heading and allow like people to maybe change the prop or something that will change the heading level. That's a great idea. Yes.
And I did come 5 minutes late, so maybe I missed this, but when I get to a new website, I'm pretty overwhelmed. I'm like, okay, what's here? And I kind of look around. So in the accessibility and context, how does that happen if someone, say, is visually impaired? What is the structure like? How do they say what is here, and how do they navigate on a really high level and then drill down where they want to go? I think I'm missing that.
So the question was like, for a website where it's very overwhelming, right, for a visual user, what happens? How does that translate into the screen reader experience, right? I would say it's pretty similar, right? Like if it's overwhelming visually, it's going to be overwhelming for a screen reader. I would say and that's kind of best practices and something that WCAG doesn't really cover too much about like cognitive disabilities or that cognitive load that you can have.
Just to clarify, like, so they're really high level semantic elements or attributes I could add, like, I don't know if it's by section, like, okay, there's 10 sections on this page, and I'm going to loop through the sections and get the titles, or is it by header level, or is it like, I just don't know what that structure looks like.
Yeah. No, I see. So again, this is just about the structure of the page. So there are things called landmarks. So people can navigate through headings. So right, the heading structure is important. They can navigate through links. That's also important. But they can also navigate through landmarks, which are kind of the sections of how you group content in your page. And rule of thumb is every section should have their own heading, right? But for example, you can see the navigation bar. That's its own landmark. The main content, so you see that main HTML element that holds the main landmark, which is the main content of your page. You could have a footer. That footer element means something to assistive technologies. So they can kind of navigate your content like that. Like for example, if you have a piece of content that's relevant to your main content, but it's more like supporting content, you could have that section be an article. And again, there's different types of landmarks, and I go over that in detail in another talk, so I can send you the link if we'll talk after. Great question. Yes.
So I've asked a few people this on the accessible world about disabled buttons. I've heard some people say they're naturally inaccessible, and you shouldn't even have a disabled button visible on the screen. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I tend to agree with that. So for example, you'll see some forms like disable the submit button until you meet all of the criteria. But for some assistive technologies, unless you go back and navigate through every single input, you might not even understand why this input, like why the submit button is missing from the page, right? So allowing people to make mistakes, so like let them submit and then create a nice error handling. So that way they can maybe, like if it's a long form, you might want to list out on top like links that lead to the specific input fields that have those errors. That way they can easily jump without having to kind of do their own investigation of like, okay, what went wrong? Like, what am I missing? Where are the error messages, right? Like help your users out, like help them understand where they went wrong and allow them very clearly to fix their issues.
To piggyback off of that, are you encouraging us to have our error messages at the top or input by input?
So question was, should we have error messages always at the top or input by input? I would say always, always, always have input by input. That should always be the standard. And usually it depends on your form. If it's like 2 input fields or 3 input fields, you might not need like a list on top. But I would say if you're passing like past 5 input fields, it will be helpful to have a little like, cheat sheet on top that just says like, Again, your inline error messages will exist, but maybe there's a little banner at the top that just says like, hey, here are the links to your errors, like your name, is missing or your email is missing, and then people could just jump through those. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
What's the best way to add accessibility into existing code?
The best way to add accessibility into existing code. Oh, that's a good one because there's so many different types of application, right? I would say the biggest impact right now, like if you're new to accessibility, your application has never considered accessibility, start keyboard testing. Just like disconnect your mouse, start keyboard testing, see what's missing, see where you can't access, try to interact with everything that you should be able to interact with, and then try to go from there. I would say baby steps. Again, running a color contrast, Chrome has automated tools built into it, like Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a great automated testing tool that they have, and you could choose to just run accessibility tests, like automated accessibility tests there, and it's really great. In fact, let me run through an example of this. And again, this is W3C, so I don't know how many errors we'll find, but I'm sure we can find one. Let's see. I'm going to jump over to Lighthouse. Again, I am in Chrome. And you could see that I can generate a desktop accessibility test here. So let's run this and see what we find. But this is a great starting place because it's going to find some errors, and it might suggest some ways to fix it, but it will also give you some, oh yeah, perfect score. I'm not surprised. Good job, good job. This is what you aim for, right? Yeah. But a quick call out, they do say that there are some things that you have to manually check. So they're not letting you get away with that. They're saying, hey, we passed our automated test. And again, automated tests will catch like 35 to 40% of accessibility issues. So this doesn't really mean that you're at 100%. And they highlight, here are the things that you yourself can test manually. And hey, I don't know how to test this. Well, they're really cool because you can expand it and they teach you about how to test for that specifically. And if let's say that they had found errors, they'll list out the errors in a very similar way to these, and you can expand those accordions to then dive deeper into their recommendations and their documentation on how to fix that specific issue that they found.
So what would be a good percentage like to be done?
100%. Well, I would say people might encounter barriers at that point, right? And we want to reduce this as much as possible. But again, I would say priority, make sure, like if, I understand that teams can't do it all, right? We have a priority list of all the things we have to do. So I would say, make sure that it's keyboard functionable, right? Like that it works with your keyboard. You should be able to tab and interact with everything. Make sure that we're not, impeding somebody to get through their flow. Yeah, and make sure that everything has accessible names and everything. That's really important. So make sure that people can access your content.
So, sort of to piggyback with what he was asking, what would you recommend as a practical step, if you will, for implementing that testing into your code and making it 100% accessible, right? Because I'm thinking, it's not done in one day, so to speak, right? It's a process, it's an incremental process. So I'm curious about what your recommendations would be.
Agreed. So recommendations of best practices to start including that in your process. Time check here, I'm 1 minute over. But one thing to call out is you can have ESLint stop you from even pushing code that's inaccessible. And again, they do run some automated tests that again won't catch everything, but they'll get developers in the right mindset of thinking about this type of issues, right? So that would be a great practice to implement. And Mitch can talk to you about some great tools that he's worked with. Anybody else? Alrighty. Let me catch you after the presentation because I think there's another presenter coming up. But thank you all so much for your time, and feel free to reach out.